Stop waiting for your children to call. I need you to hear that, because it might be the most important sentence in this entire video, and I say it not as criticism, but as a doctor who has spent almost 30 years watching what happens to the human body and the human spirit when we quietly hand our entire well-being over to people who are busy, distracted, and living their own lives 3 time zones away. I'm Dr. James Carter, not here to make you feel guilty for loving your family. I'm here to tell you something that very few people in my profession will say out loud, because it sounds harsh until you understand the science behind it. The seniors who age the slowest, who stay sharpest, who recover fastest from illness and injury, are very often not the ones with the most attentive children. They're the ones who built something else, something sturdier, something that doesn't cancel on you. There's a study that's been quietly circulating in longevity research circles for a few years now, tracking older adults across multiple countries, and the pattern is almost eerie in its consistency. Seniors who reported their primary source of emotional and practical support as family alone showed measurably higher markers of chronic stress, things like elevated cortisol and inflammatory markers in the blood, compared to seniors who had built a wider support structure, things like community groups, structured exercise routines, and consistent daily purpose. We're talking about a difference of roughly 30% in reported life satisfaction scores and a noticeably lower rate of hospital readmission within 90 days of a major health event. 30%. Sit with that for a second. That's not a rounding error. That's the difference between thriving in your 70s and 80s and just getting by. Now, before we dive into the 5 things I believe every senior needs to build into their life, starting today, I want to do something I do in every single video, because I actually mean it. Tell me in the comments how old you are right now, and tell me one thing you've been quietly worried about when it comes to your health or your independence. I read every single comment. Every one. Not my assistant, not some intern, me. Usually with a cup of coffee before my first patient of the day. Some of the stories you've shared with me have genuinely shaped how I practice medicine, and I want to hear from you today too. I'll tell you right now, the item at the very top of this list, the one thing that surprised even me when the research kept pointing to it over and over again, has almost nothing to do with your muscles, your heart, or your blood pressure. It has to do with a sense of daily purpose, and I promise you, by the time we get there, you'll understand why I rank it above diet, above exercise, above almost everything else we typically talk about on this channel. But we have to build up to it properly, because each of these 5 things works better when the ones before it are already in place. So let's start at number 5 and count our way down to the most powerful one. Number 5, your community. Not your family, your community. I want you to picture a woman named Dorothy, 78 years old, from a small town outside Asheville, North Carolina. Dorothy came to see me about 2 years ago, referred by another physician because her recovery from a hip replacement had stalled in a way that didn't make medical sense. Her labs were fine. Her physical therapy compliance was fine, but she wasn't improving the way we'd expect. When I sat down and actually talked to her, not just about her hip, but about her life, I learned that her only son had moved to Seattle, called maybe once every couple of weeks, and Dorothy spent most of her days alone in a house built for 4 people. She had, in her words, nothing to get up for. Within 3 months of joining a local senior walking group and a weekly card game at her church, without changing a single thing about her physical therapy regimen, her recovery accelerated in a way her physical therapist described as remarkable. Here's the science behind why this happens, and I'll explain it simply. Chronic loneliness triggers a low-grade, persistent activation of your body's stress response, similar to what happens when you're under constant low-level threat. Researchers sometimes call this social pain, and your brain actually processes it using some of the same pathways as physical pain. This constant low hum of stress keeps a hormone called cortisol elevated in your bloodstream, and chronically elevated cortisol does real, measurable damage over time. It suppresses your immune system's ability to fight off infection, it interferes with wound healing, and it actively works against your body's ability to build and repair tissue, something called an anti-anabolic effect, meaning it fights against your body's ability to grow and rebuild. For seniors already dealing with what's called anabolic resistance, a frustrating condition where your aging muscles become less responsive to the normal signals that tell them to grow and repair. Adding chronic loneliness on top of that is like trying to build a house while someone is quietly removing bricks from the foundation every night. If you're watching this, and you know your social circle has shrunk, and for most seniors it does shrink, friends move, spouses pass, mobility becomes harder, I want you to do one specific thing this week. Not, try to be more social. That's too vague, and honestly, it's useless advice. I want you to identify one recurring group activity, something that happens on the same day, same time, every single week. A walking group, a faith community, a hobby class, a senior center bridge game. It genuinely does not matter what it is. The regularity is what matters, because your brain and body respond to predictable social rhythm the same way they respond to a predictable sleep schedule. And here's your synergy tip for this one. Pair your new social commitment with light physical movement whenever possible, a walking group instead of a stationary card game, because movement combined with social connection has been shown to amplify the mood benefits of both far more than either one alone. Number 4. Structured strength and movement. And I want to be very clear, I am not talking about the kind of exercise advice you've heard 1,000 times. I'm talking about something specific and deliberate. Let me tell you about Harold, 81 years old, a retired mechanic from outside Toledo, Ohio. Harold came into my office convinced his declining mobility was simply what happens at his age. Something he'd accepted the way you accept gray hair. What Harold didn't know, and what most people your age are never told clearly enough, is that after the age of 70, the average adult can lose somewhere in the range of 15 to 20% of their remaining muscle strength per decade if that muscle isn't actively and deliberately challenged. This isn't just about looking frail. This is about your ability to get up from a chair without using your hands, your ability to catch yourself if you trip, your ability to carry your own groceries. We started Harold on a simple, twice-weekly resistance routine, nothing dramatic, resistance bands and body weight movements, and within 4 months, his physical therapist measured a genuine, significant improvement in his grip strength and his walking speed, numbers that translate directly into a lower risk of falls. Here's why this matters so specifically for aging bodies. I mentioned anabolic resistance earlier, that frustrating tendency for older muscle tissue to respond less efficiently to the normal building signals your body sends. Think of it like a delivery truck that used to drop packages right at your front door, but now it drops them at the curb, and someone has to specifically go retrieve them, or they just sit there and never get used. Resistance exercise is essentially what forces that retrieval to happen. It sends an unmistakably loud signal to your muscle tissue that says, "We still need this, rebuild it." And it does something else remarkable too. It improves the efficiency of your mitochondria, which are the tiny structures inside your cells that produce your energy. Aging mitochondria become less efficient over time, almost like an old furnace that burns more fuel to produce less heat, and regular strength training has been shown to meaningfully improve how efficiently those aging cells produce usable energy. For timing and preparation, I recommend 2 to 3 sessions per week, and contrary to what a lot of younger fitness influencers will tell you, more is not automatically better here. Your recovery time matters just as much as the exercise itself. Morning sessions tend to work best for most seniors, both because cortisol and core body temperature are naturally positioned to support physical activity earlier in the day, and frankly because compliance is simply higher. You're less likely to skip a workout you haven't had all day to talk yourself out of. And your synergy tip: pair resistance training with a source of protein within roughly an hour or two afterward, because that combination has been shown to meaningfully improve how effectively your muscles actually use that protein to rebuild, compared to protein consumed on its own at some other point in the day. Now, before we get into the top 3, and trust me, they get more surprising from here, I need to ask you for something. If this video is giving you even one piece of information you're going to use, hit that subscribe button right now, and tap the like button too, because it genuinely helps this channel reach more seniors who need to hear this. I don't say that lightly. I say it because I've had viewers write in and tell me a video like this one changed how they approached their own recovery, and the only reason they found it is because someone else liked and shared it first. So, if you're still with me, take 2 seconds, hit subscribe, and let's get into number 3. Number 3. A deliberate nutritional strategy, and I want to emphasize the word deliberate, because most seniors are not eating badly, they're eating on autopilot, the same patterns they've had for decades, without accounting for how dramatically their nutritional needs have shifted. Let me tell you about Rosalind, 73, from a suburb outside Phoenix, Arizona. Rosalind came to me feeling constantly fatigued, and her diet, on paper, looked perfectly reasonable. The kind of eating pattern that would have served her beautifully at 50. The problem is, she wasn't 50 anymore, and neither is her digestive and metabolic system. Here's what most people don't fully understand about aging and nutrition. As we get older, our bodies become measurably less efficient at absorbing and utilizing several key nutrients, even when we're eating what looks like a balanced diet. Protein absorption is a major one, tied directly back to that anabolic resistance I mentioned earlier, meaning older adults typically need a noticeably higher amount of protein per meal than younger adults just to trigger the same muscle-building response. Vitamin B12 absorption also declines with age because stomach acid production, which is necessary to release B12 from food, tends to decrease over time. And low B12 can quietly contribute to fatigue and even cognitive fog that gets mistakenly written off as just getting older. And then there's chronic, low-grade inflammation. Sometimes researchers call this inflammaging, a slow, persistent inflammatory state that tends to increase with age and is linked to nearly every major chronic condition we worry about: heart disease, cognitive decline, joint deterioration. Think of your digestive system after 70 like an aging factory. It still works, but it's not running at full capacity anymore. And if you keep sending it the same raw materials in the same quantities you did decades ago, expecting the same output, you're going to come up short. For Rosalind, we didn't overhaul her entire diet. We made targeted adjustments, spreading her protein intake more evenly across 3 meals instead of loading most of it at dinner, adding foods naturally rich in B12, and incorporating more anti-inflammatory foods like fatty fish and colorful vegetables. Within roughly 6 weeks, she reported a meaningful improvement in her energy levels, and her follow-up blood work reflected genuine improvement in her nutritional markers. For practical timing, aim to include a solid protein source at every single meal, rather than concentrating it at dinner, since your body can only effectively use so much protein for muscle repair in one sitting. Roughly 25 to 30 grams per meal is a reasonable target for most seniors, though of course this should be personalized with your own physician. And your synergy tip here: pair your protein intake with light movement later in the day, even a short walk, because physical activity essentially primes your muscles to be more receptive to that protein, making the whole system work together rather than as isolated habits. Number 2. Consistent sleep and structured recovery. And this is the one people underestimate the most, because we tend to think of sleep as passive, as simply not being awake, when in reality, it's one of the most active repair processes your body performs. Let me tell you about Walter, 76, from a small community outside Madison, Wisconsin. Walter came to me primarily concerned about his memory, worried, understandably, about early cognitive decline. What we discovered instead was a sleep pattern that had quietly deteriorated over the years, waking multiple times a night, rarely reaching what's called deep sleep, the stage of sleep where your brain performs much of its overnight cleanup and memory consolidation work. Here's why this matters so specifically as we age. During deep sleep, your brain activates something researchers have described almost like a cleaning system, clearing away metabolic waste products that accumulate during your waking hours. As we get older, we naturally spend less time in this deep sleep stage, sometimes a reduction of 30% or more compared to our younger years, which means that overnight cleanup process becomes less thorough, night after night, compounding over time. This isn't just about feeling tired. Poor deep sleep has been linked to impaired glucose regulation, elevated inflammation, and yes, measurable effects on memory and cognitive clarity. For Walter, we focused on what's called sleep hygiene, consistent bedtimes, limiting light exposure in the evening, and addressing a mild issue with his evening caffeine intake that he genuinely hadn't connected to his sleep at all. Within 2 months, his subjective memory concerns had improved enough that he told me he felt like fog had lifted. For practical steps, aim for a consistent sleep and wake time, even on weekends, since your circadian rhythm, your internal body clock, responds far better to consistency than to any single perfect bedtime. Dim your lights in the hour before bed, since light exposure, especially blue light from screens, can suppress your body's natural production of melatonin, the hormone that signals it's time to sleep. And your synergy tip: pair your wind-down routine with the same resistance exercise we discussed earlier, but scheduled earlier in the day rather than close to bedtime, because regular physical activity has consistently been shown to improve both how quickly you fall asleep and how much time you spend in that critical deep sleep stage. Which brings us to number 1, the item I promised you at the beginning of this video, the one that surprised even me. Purpose. A daily, tangible reason to get out of bed that has nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with meaning. I want you to think back to Dorothy, the woman from Asheville I told you about earlier. Her hip recovery didn't truly accelerate when she started walking more. It accelerated when she rejoined her church's meal delivery program, when she had somewhere to be that needed her specifically. That distinction matters enormously. There's a pattern researchers have observed repeatedly in older populations, sometimes referred to as having a sense of purpose, or what some longevity researchers call ikigai, a reason for being. Seniors who report a strong daily sense of purpose show meaningfully better outcomes across nearly every measure we track. Lower rates of cognitive decline, better cardiovascular markers, and notably lower mortality risk over long-term studies, even when researchers control for other health factors like diet and exercise. Let that sink in for a moment. Purpose isn't just a nice emotional bonus sitting on top of your physical health. It appears to be its own independent driver of how well and how long you live. Here's why this works on a biological level, as best we understand it. A strong sense of purpose has been associated with lower levels of that same chronic stress hormone, cortisol, we discussed earlier, and lower systemic inflammation, essentially calming that inflammaging process rather than fueling it. There's also a behavioral piece that matters just as much as the biology. People with a strong daily purpose are simply more consistent with the other things we've talked about today. They show up for their walking group, they take their supplements, they follow through on their physical therapy, because they have an internal reason pulling them forward rather than an external obligation pushing them. For practical steps, I want you to identify one role, however small it seems, where someone or something depends specifically on you. This could be volunteering, mentoring, caring for a pet, tending a garden others rely on, or a regular commitment within your community. The scale doesn't matter nearly as much as the specificity and consistency of it. And your synergy tip, the final one of this video, is simply this. Layer your sense of purpose on top of the community connection we discussed at number 5, because purpose that exists within a social context, where other people see your contribution and depend on it, tends to be far more sustainable and far more protective than purpose pursued in isolation. As always, I've included the research references for everything we discussed today in the description box below, so you can look into the details yourself and talk to your own physician about what applies to your specific situation. I want to leave you with something before we close out today. Every single one of the 5 things we've talked about, your community, your strength, your nutrition, your sleep, and your sense of purpose, they all have one thing in common. They are entirely within your control, starting today, regardless of how often your phone rings or how far away your children live. That's not a criticism of your family, it's a gift to yourself, because independence, real independence, the kind that lets you live in your own home, make your own decisions, and wake up with a reason to greet the day, isn't something anyone else can hand you. It has to be built, deliberately, one habit at a time. And I have watched patients in their 70s and 80s build it from nothing and completely transform their quality of life. It is genuinely never too late to start. So subscribe if you haven't already, because I put out videos like this every single week. And before you go, tell me in the comments which one of these 5 areas you're going to focus on first. I read every comment, and I mean that. I'll see you in the next video.